Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you've chosen to settle in with me tonight for a quiet journey into the past. Let's leave the noise of the present day behind and find a moment of stillness together. History is a vast and gentle river, and we're just going to drift along its currents for a while. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening, so feel free to leave a comment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a farmer. Your world is defined not by clocks or calendars, but by the slow turning wheel of the seasons. Your day begins before the sun, with the lowing of a single precious cow and the rough texture of a wooden bucket handle in your palm. The air is cool and thick with the scent of damp earth and hay. Your life is a tapestry woven from familiar threads, the ache in your back from bending over the furrowed soil, the warmth of the sun on your neck in high summer, the grit of dirt under your fingernails that never quite washes away. This life is not easy, but it is known. You understand its rhythms, its demands, its small, quiet rewards, the taste of bread baked from your own grain, the sight of your children sleeping soundly on their straw pallets. This predictable world is shattered not by a trumpet's call to glory, but by the dull rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves approaching your small wattle and daub home. It's the Lord's Reeve, a man whose face is as hard and unforgiving as a winter frost. He doesn't offer you a choice. He delivers a summons. The king is mustering an army to fight in a land you've only heard of in travelers' whispers. And your lord is required to provide men. You and others like you are part of that provision. There is no gleaming poster of a heroic knight, no rousing speech about patriotism. This is a transaction, a fulfillment of an ancient obligation. You live on this land, you work this land, but you do not own it. In exchange for this patch of earth and the Lord's so-called protection, you owe service. And today, that debt is being called in. This recruitment process is a far cry from a modern enlistment office. It's a levy, a sweep through the countryside to gather up the able-bodied. For some, it might represent a sliver of opportunity, a desperate flight from the crushing bonds of serfdom. To leave the land you are legally tied to is a crime, but to leave with the Lord's blessing to go to war, well, that's another matter entirely. It is a dangerous gamble, trading the certainty of hardship for the possibility of something else. Anything else. It's a testament to the quiet desperation of this life that the prospect of marching to a foreign field to face sharpened steel could be seen as a potential step up. Indeed, historians still debate the extent to which the average soldier was a willing volunteer versus a feudal conscript. But as you stand there before the reeve, the concept of volunteering feels remarkably distant. The choice is between going or facing consequences that could leave your family without a home or livelihood. It is, in essence, no choice at all. The reeve, perhaps sensing your profound lack of enthusiasm, might then speak of the incentives. He'll mention pay, a few pence a day. To a modern ear, it sounds like nothing, but to you, it is more coin than you might hold in your hands in an entire year. It's the kind of money that could buy a new tool, a piglet, or enough grain to see your family through a lean winter with a little less fear gnawing at the edges of your sleep. Of course, the promise of coin is not always kept. In a fascinatingly practical quirk of medieval logistics, you might instead be promised payment in goods. The reeve might gesture vaguely towards the Lord's vast stores and mention payment in sacks of wool or barrels of salted fish. It's a bit like being paid in company stock options that you can't actually trade, at least with the wool. You could try to knit a very uncomfortable sweater for the journey. Beyond the meager and perhaps non-existent pay. The other benefits are abstract. You will be fed, though the quality of that food is a subject best left unexplored for now. You will be clothed, after a fashion. You will see the world, though that world may consist mostly of muddy roads, smoky campsites, and the backs of the men marching in front of you. This is not a quest for honor. There are no illusions of returning to a cheering crowd, draped in medals and glory. This is a job, an unappealing one, accepted out of necessity. It is the medieval equivalent of taking on a dangerous gig in a remote location because the rent is due and the cupboards are bare. And here lies a quiet, bitter irony that you may or may not ever learn. The knight who is your direct lord, the man in the chain of command just above you, may not even be going. The system of scutage, or shield money, often allowed a wealthy lord to pay a tax to the king instead of fulfilling his own military service. He could essentially buy his way out of the danger and discomfort of a campaign. It's a practice that ensures the king gets the funds he needs to hire professional mercenaries, but it does little for the feudal levy. So, while your master pays in gold to remain by his warm hearth, you pay with your presence, trading your farming tools for a roughly made spear. It seems working from home was an executive privilege even then. You are not his replacement. Not really. You are simply a different resource to be deployed. He provides wealth. You provide a body. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of profound resignation, you nod your head to the reeve. The decision was made for you long before the horse ever appeared on the horizon. You turn and look at your field, half plowed, the dark, rich soil waiting for a hand that will no longer be there to guide the plow. The journey has begun. You have given your oath, or perhaps it was given for you. The abstract notion of service, of loyalty to a lord or a cause, has now settled into a much more pressing and immediate reality. You need gear, and as you stand in the cool morning air, the scent of damp soil and wood smoke filling your lungs, you quickly realize there is no kindly quartermaster, no well-stocked armory with neat rows of polished steel waiting for you. The whole concept is a fantasy, a modern convenience we take for granted, like a well-organized hardware store. For you, the process of gearing up is a grim and personal scavenger hunt. Your first piece of equipment might be an inheritance of sorts, though not a welcome one. Imagine a spear being placed in your hands. It is not new. The long shaft of ash wood is dark and smooth, not from polish, but from the sweat and oil of countless hands that have held it before you. Perhaps your father's, or an uncle's, or perhaps it simply belonged to the last man who lived in your cottage and answered this same call. You run your hand over its surface, feeling the faint grain and the occasional small notch or splinter. The spearhead itself is a simple, leaf-shaped piece of iron, tinged with a delicate patina of rust in the crevices where it meets the wood. It is functional, but it carries the silent history of its previous owners. There is a weight to it that is more than just physical. It is the weight of expectation and the unspoken truth of where such weapons end up. There is no fanfare, just the quiet, heavy reality of the tool now in your possession. This ad hoc approach was born of simple, brutal economics. This is the mainstream, unavoidable fact of your new life. Good armor was prohibitively expensive. We see knights in shining plate and assume everyone had a measure of protection. But that couldn't be further from the truth. For a common soldier, even a simple steel helmet, what they called a kettle hat for its resemblance to an upside-down cooking pot, might cost more than one of the family's precious few cows. A coat of mail, a hauberk of thousands of interlinked iron rings, was the medieval equivalent of a luxury car. Its cost could represent years of a skilled craftsman's wages. So you and the men standing around you were a patchwork of meager defenses. A leather cap, perhaps boiled to make it harder, a small wooden shield. its surface hopefully covered in tough hide. Most would have nothing more than their everyday clothing. The battlefield was not a sea of shining steel, but a motley collection of men, most of whom were gambling their lives on the simple hope of not being hit. But this does not mean you were entirely without options. Let's talk about one of the most underrated and ubiquitous pieces of defensive gear in history. Our quirky tidbit for this journey: the gambeson. Picture a thick, padded jacket, almost like a heavy quilt, tailored to your body. It might be made of linen, wool, or canvas, with dozens of layers stuffed with horsehair, scrap cloth, or raw cotton. The entire garment is then stitched through in tight, parallel lines or a diamond pattern, which keeps the padding from shifting and adds to its structural integrity. It might smell a bit like a damp stable or an old attic, a testament to its humble materials. Yet, this simple jacket was surprisingly effective. It could absorb the kinetic force of a blunt weapon, turning a bone-shattering blow into a painful but survivable bruise. A sword cut that would slice through leather might be stopped by the densely packed layers of fabric. It wouldn't make you invincible, but it was affordable, accessible, and far, far better than nothing. It was the sensible, practical armor of the people. The medieval puffer jacket, just without the trendy logo and a much grimmer purpose. With your inherited spear and perhaps a hand-me-down gambeson, you still feel terribly vulnerable. Your thoughts turn to the marketplace, or more likely, the edge of camp where a traveling smith or merchant has set up shop. Here, you can try to fill the gaps in your protection. You clutch the few coins you have, their metallic scent clinging to your palm. The air hums with the low clang of a hammer on an anvil, not forging new masterpieces, but repairing old, damaged goods. You might find a helmet for sale. It has a significant dent on one side, a silent testament to its previous owner's very bad day. The smith assures you he's hammered it out as best he can. You try it on. It wobbles. He offers to sell you a leather liner for an extra coin. You might see a shield, its face bearing the faded emblem of a family you don't recognize. A silent story of a battle lost. This is not shopping. It is a desperate calculus of risk and resources. Every purchase is a gamble, a hope that this dented piece of steel is better than the open air it replaces. It's the grimmest form of thrifting imaginable. And as you stand there, weighing the merits of a rusty helmet versus saving your money for more food, your eyes might drift to the Lord's personal retinue. There you see it, the pinnacle of the armorer's art, the full suit of plate. It gleams with an almost celestial light, each piece articulating perfectly with the next. It looks invincible, impenetrable, and yet, even this iconic image is a source of contention. Scholars still argue about the true weight and mobility of full-plate armor, and whether its reputation for clumsiness is deserved. While a poorly fitted or mass-produced suit could indeed be a clanking, awkward prison, a master-crafted suit tailored to its wearer was a marvel of engineering, allowing for a surprising range of motion. A knight in good armor could run, mount a horse, and even do a somersault, should the mood strike him. Of course, that's all academic to you. You'd just be happy with a helmet that didn't feel like you were wearing a bucket, and you hope that maybe, just maybe, you'll find something a little better later on. Before the clash of steel, before the grand strategies are put to the test, there is this. There is only the walk. The great campaign you have joined begins not with a trumpet's call to glory, but with the soft, rhythmic squelch of 1,000 pairs of boots sinking into mud. This is the long, agonizing walk, the true, unglamorous foundation of medieval warfare. Imagine yourself in the column, one anonymous figure among a serpent of men snaking its way across the landscape. The first thing you would notice is the road, or rather, the lack of one. The grand paved thoroughfares of the Roman Empire are a distant memory, buried under centuries of dirt and neglect. What you march on is a track, a wide, rutted path churned into a brown porridge by the thousands who have walked it before you. With every step, your foot sinks, and the cold, wet mud tries to claim your shoe. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, crushed greenery, and the faint, ever-present aroma of wet wool from your own tunic and the backs of the men in front and behind you. This slow, grueling pace is a defining feature of the era. Mainstream history confirms that medieval armies moved incredibly slowly, often covering only 10 to 15 miles on a good day. Think of that. A distance you might cover in a 20-minute drive is, for you, an entire day's exhausting labor, from the gray light of dawn until the weary twilight, and this day is repeated, endlessly. The sun rises, you shoulder your gear, you walk. The sun sets, you drop your gear, you sleep, and the next day, it is the same. Weeks of this grind the spirit down, turning anticipation into a dull, aching patience. The world shrinks to the space around you, the back of the man ahead, the shifting ground beneath your feet, the monotonous horizon that never seems to get any closer. Your most intimate relationship on this journey is with your shoes. They are not the sturdy, supportive boots of a modern hiker. They are simple leather turn shoes, perhaps little more than thick leather socks with a tougher sole, likely bought cheap or issued without a thought for your specific size. Within hours, the constant dampness soaks them through. They stretch, they rub, and they create blisters that quickly turn into raw, open sores. Every single step becomes a carefully negotiated moment of pain. It is here that you learn the profound, almost sacred importance of a tiny piece of technology, the hobnail. This is the quirky tidbit that separates the walking from the crippled. Small iron nails with wide, flattened heads are hammered by the dozen into the leather soles. They are your salvation. They provide a desperately needed layer of protection, keeping the leather from wearing through to your skin in a matter of days. They offer a bit of traction in the slick mud and on treacherous slopes. A soldier who loses his hobnails is a soldier who will soon be left behind. It was the medieval equivalent of checking your tire pressure, except a blowout meant you were out of the war, and quite possibly out of luck entirely. Over your shoulder, a strap digs into your flesh, connected to the crushing weight of your meager gear. It is not much by modern standards, but after 10 miles, it feels like a boulder. A rolled wool blanket, a small iron pot for cooking, a water skin, a small bag of dried meat or hard biscuits, and, of course, your weapons. The combined weight settles into your bones, a constant, dull ache in your shoulders and lower back. The shield on your other arm feels impossibly heavy, its strap chafing your skin raw. You learn to shift the weight, to adjust your posture, to find a rhythm that makes the burden just barely tolerable. The sounds of the march become a strange, hypnotic symphony. The rhythmic tramp and squelch of feet, the jingle of mail and buckles, the creak of leather, the low murmur of thousands of tired men, punctuated by a cough, a muttered curse, or the occasional bleak attempt at a joke. The collective smell of the army on the move is something you can never quite forget. Unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and damp clothing, a potent miasma that probably did more to scatter crows than any scarecrow could. This vast, slow-moving organism of an army requires constant fuel, and so the question of food becomes paramount. There's considerable discussion among experts about the logistics of feeding a large army on the move and how often foraging deviated into outright pillaging. Official supply wagons, crawling along these same terrible roads, can only carry so much and are often far behind the main force. So, you are expected to forage. In theory, this is an organized process of gathering surplus from the local countryside. In practice, For the peasant whose farm you are marching through, the line between a soldier taking a few chickens and a marauder stripping his family of their winter stores is terrifyingly thin. You see the faces of the people watching the army pass a mixture of fear, resentment, and weary resignation. For you, it is a matter of survival. For them, your survival may mean their ruin. It is a grim, unspoken tension that hangs in the air, as heavy as the morning fog. For weeks, your greatest enemy is not the opposing army, but your own body, the weather, and a particularly sharp stone that has worked its way inside your shoe. The glory of battle is a distant, abstract concept. The reality is the walk. And so you walk on, one foot in front of the other, into the heart of the country and into the pages of history. The march, for now, is over. The fortress walls are complete, the ditches dug deep into the foreign soil. You have made camp. And as you settle into this new, temporary home, a different kind of enemy reveals itself, an opponent more relentless than any Germanic tribe or Parthian horseman. This new enemy is boredom. The days between marches and the thrilling terror of battle stretch out into a vast, featureless expanse. A quiet war fought not with a sword, but against the slow, grinding passage of time itself. Your world shrinks to the confines of your contubernum. The 8-man tent or small barrack room that is your home, it's a cramped space of leather, wood, and wool that smells perpetually of damp earth, old sweat, and stale air. Here, the hours are filled with a quiet, repetitive, and almost meditative rhythm. You might spend an entire afternoon meticulously sharpening your gladius, the gentle shing, shing, shing of whetstone on steel, a familiar and steadying sound in the relative quiet. You clean and oil each metal plate of your lorica segmentata, fur, checking the leather straps and brass fittings for wear, knowing that a broken tie in the heat of battle could be a fatal inconvenience. You might spend an hour repairing your hobnailed sandals, the heavy calige, demae, hammering in a loose stud, your mind wandering to the memory of the last long march or the thought of the next. This constant maintenance is essential for survival, but it is also a vital bulwark against the suffocating monotony of camp life. When the chores are finally done, the dice come out. You and your tent mates huddle around a cloak spread on the ground, tossing polished knuckle bones from a sheep, the astragali, their irregular four-sided shapes adding a frustrating element of chance that smooth, six-sided dice would lack. The stakes are rarely high. You might gamble for a few small coins from your meager pay, for another man's ration of sour wine, or for the dubious honor of being exempt from digging the next latrine pit. The sounds are hushed and intimate, the dry rattle of the bones in a calloused hand, the soft thud as they land on the woolen cloth, the low grumbles of a loss, and the quiet, smug satisfaction of a win. It's a common joke that your centurion possesses an uncanny luck, as if he's made a personal pact with the goddess Fortuna herself. You suspect, however, that his luck has less to do with divine favor and more to do with a finely honed ability to spot a nervous tick across a smoky tent. The air itself is a constant, oppressive companion, thick with a complex symphony of odors. The dominant note is humanity. The sour, ubiquitous smell of thousands of sweating men in woolen tunics living in close proximity. Woven into this is the sharp, acrid tang of wood smoke from countless cooking fires, the rich, earthy scent of the stables where the mules and officers' horses are kept, and the ever-present, faint but insistent aroma from the latrines. It is a miasma you eventually stop noticing, a scent that simply becomes the air you breathe, the defining atmosphere of your world, much like the sea is to a sailor. This overwhelming proximity to filth is more than just an unpleasant fact of life. It is a mortal danger. For every legionary who falls to a barbarian's spear, history shows that many more will be laid low by an unseen enemy that breeds in the water and festers in the waste. Disease, particularly dysentery. A grim and debilitating condition you know simply as the bloody flux, is the true silent killer of the legions. It sweeps through the close-packed barracks with terrifying speed and efficiency, leaving even the strongest men weak, dehydrated, and hollowed out. It is a far less glorious end than one might find on the battlefield. A slow fading in a foul-smelling tent, and the fear of it is a quiet, constant undercurrent in camp life. You hear stories of the great military manuals, the treatises written by learned men in Rome who have likely never spent a winter on the Rhine. They speak of ideal camp layouts, of positioning latrines far downstream and away from the kitchens, of digging deep wells to ensure a pure water supply. And yet, as you look around at the pragmatic, often messy reality of your encampment, you understand precisely why. Historians still argue whether the strict camp hygiene regulations we read about in military treatises were ever truly enforced. On a long campaign, in hostile territory, expediency often trumps theory. The centurion is far more concerned with the defensive palisade being finished by nightfall than whether the latrine ditch is precisely 50 paces from the nearest water source. It becomes clear that some official regulations were treated more like friendly suggestions. But life is not confined solely within the fortress walls. Just outside the main gate, a sprawling, chaotic, and wonderfully vibrant civilian settlement springs up. A town known as the Vicus. This is the world of the camp followers, a crucial and often misunderstood part of the military ecosystem. And while there are certainly wine shops and women of negotiable affection, the vital role of camp followers extends far beyond that. They are the essential laundresses, cooks, and merchants who provide services the army itself cannot or will not. Here, you can find a woman who will wash your tunic for a small coin, scrubbing out the grime of the march until it is almost respectable again. Here, you can buy a hot sausage that tastes infinitely better than your daily ration of hardtack and preserved bacon, even if you prudently decide not to think too hard about its exact contents. Merchants sell everything from cheap trinkets to higher quality leather for repairs. The Vicus is the Legion's connection to a world of small comforts, a place of commerce and vice, and a necessary pressure valve for the thousands of men confined to the rigid discipline of the camp. This is your world. Now a cycle of tedious work, small gambles, and the constant, quiet struggle to stay clean, healthy, and sane until the trumpets sound once more. A deep, gnawing ache settles in the pit of your stomach. It is a constant companion, a dull thrumming beneath your ribs that colors every waking moment and haunts your dreams. You are hungry, always. This is a hunger that modern life, with its pantries and refrigerators, has largely erased from memory. It is a fundamental, primal need that, for a soldier on campaign, is rarely satisfied. Forget the romanticized images of grand medieval feasts, the roasted swans, the overflowing platters of fruit, the spiced wines. Your reality is far grittier, far more substantial, in the most literal sense of the word. Let's begin with the cornerstone of your diet, the very foundation of military sustenance, bread. But this is not the soft, warm loaf you might imagine. This is hardtack. The name itself is a warning. It is a simple biscuit made of flour, water, and sometimes a little salt, baked multiple times until it is devoid of almost all moisture. The result is a square or round of bread so dense, so unbelievably hard. It feels more like a piece of fired clay or a slab of wood in your hand. Tapping it against a stone produces a sharp, resonant clack. To eat it dry is to risk a chipped tooth, a painful lesson many new recruits learn the hard way. The only viable method is to break off a piece and let it soak. You might submerge it in your ale, in water, or if you're lucky, in a thin stew. You watch as it slowly, stubbornly absorbs the liquid, turning from a rock into a sodden, pulpy mass. It has very little flavor of its own, serving mostly as a vehicle for whatever liquid it's in and as a dense, stomach-filling ballast. Sometimes, as you chew the softened biscuit, you find little dark specks, weevils or their larvae, baked into the flour. To a veteran, they are just a bit of extra protein. One of the small and dark jokes that pass between soldiers is that hardtack could be used to build fortifications, and it would likely outlast the men defending them. Next on the menu is the protein. This almost always comes preserved, as fresh meat is a luxury reserved for the nobility or for fortunate foraging parties. Your portion will be meat or fish so heavily salted it makes your eyes water. Imagine a barrel filled to the brim with coarse gray salt, and packed within are stiff, reddish-brown chunks of beef or pale, leathery fillets of cod or herring. The salt has drawn out all the moisture, curing the flesh and preserving it for months, even years. When your ration is doled out, it is a stiff, salty plank. You have to boil it, often for a very long time, changing the water repeatedly to draw out the punishing amount of salt. Even then, the flavor that remains is intensely briny, the texture often stringy and tough, a challenge for even the strongest jaw. The smell that fills the camp as this meat boils is one of old salt and simmering fat, a scent that promises calories but little in the way of culinary delight. To wash this all down, you have your ration of ale or beer. But again, this is not the rich, flavorful craft bow of a city tavern. This is small beer, a beverage made from the second or even third runnings of water through the mashed grains. It is thin, watery, and has a very low alcohol content. Its primary purpose is not intoxication, but hydration. In an age where water sources were often contaminated and dangerous, the brewing process killed off harmful bacteria, making even this weak ale a safer bet than drinking from an unknown stream. It provides a few extra calories and does just enough to quench the thirst brought on by the salted meat. The diet, as you can sense, was incredibly monotonous and often nutritionally deficient. This lack of variety and essential vitamins, particularly vitamin C, would have a serious impact, leading to weakness, lethargy, and a susceptibility to diseases like scurvy, which could cripple an army far more effectively than any enemy sword. But what happens when even these meager supplies run out? When the supply lines are cut? When the foraging parties come back empty-handed and the hardtack barrels are empty? Desperation breeds a grim creativity. This is where you might witness one of history's more peculiar and telling survival tactics, the practice of boiling leather. During times of extreme starvation, soldiers would turn to the very items they wore. A leather belt, a scabbard, or even the uppers of a worn-out shoe would be cut into strips and boiled for hours upon hours. The relentless heat would slowly break down the tough, tanned hide, causing it to release any fats, oils, and collagen locked within. The result would be a greasy, gelatinous broth. It would taste foul with the smoky, acrid flavor of boiled animal skin, but it contained just enough caloric value to potentially keep a person alive for another day or two. It's a somber thought that your finest accessory could become your last meal. The grimness of this reality has led to a persistent question among those who study the past. Experts continue to debate the average daily caloric intake of a medieval soldier and its direct impact on their combat effectiveness. On one hand, some records of rations suggest a surprisingly high number of calories. perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 a day, primarily from bread and ale. This would theoretically be enough to fuel the intense physical demands of marching and fighting. However, other scholars argue that these are ideal figures, representing what a soldier was supposed to receive, not what they actually got. They point to the frequent accounts of famine, logistical collapse, and spoiled provisions, suggesting that soldiers often operated on a severe caloric deficit, a state of managed starvation that would have profoundly affected their strength, stamina, and morale on the battlefield. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a fluctuating reality of feast and famine, where a soldier's fighting ability was tied directly to the success or failure of the humble supply wagon. The contract you signed, the one you made with a thumbprint or a shaky scrawl upon joining the Fanlin, was built on a single foundational promise pay, a regular stipulated wage, known as the sold. This was your due, the official recognition from a prince or an emperor that your life, for a time, belonged to them. The muster, that formal roll call we spoke of earlier, wasn't just for counting heads. It was, in theory, an act of accounting, the basis for calculating who was owed what. For a common soldier, a pikeman, or an arquebusier, this was a set monthly amount, perhaps 4 guilders a month, not a fortune, but enough to live on to replace worn-out shoes, to send a little back home. And for some, like the veteran Doppelsoldner who formed the front lines, the promise was double pay for double the risk. They were expected to face the first cavalry charge, to break the enemy's pike square, to perform the most hazardous duties. It seems a fair, if rather grim transaction, though one might argue whether facing a wall of charging knights is truly only double. The risk of standing safely in the third rank, Renaissance-era risk assessment, was perhaps more of an art than a science. So, you stand for the muster, you answer when your name is called, and you wait for the paymaster. You imagine the satisfying weight of silver guilders in your hand, the smooth, cool feel of a coin that represents a month of your life. But as the weeks drift by, the paymaster and his war chest remain a persistent rumor, a subject of ever more fantastical speculation. The excuses filter down through the ranks, passed from the colonel to the captains to the sergeants. The money is on its way, held up by bandits. The bankers are negotiating new terms. The prince had some unexpected expenses, what with his daughter's wedding and the construction of a new fountain shaped like a griffin. The initial grumbling in the camp, once a low and ignorable hum, slowly grows in volume and texture. It becomes the background noise to every activity, a constant, abrasive sound like stones grinding together. This is where the mainstream historical fact rings most true soldiers were often paid irregularly, and these delays were a corrosive acid on morale. Hope sours into resentment. Loyalty becomes a commodity with an expiration date. Your stomach rumbles. A more immediate and honest accountant than any paymaster. Your boots, once sturdy, now have soles that flap with every step, speaking a language of worn-out leather and broken promises. This is when your gaze begins to shift. You look at a passing merchant's wagon, not with idle curiosity, but with a calculating eye. You notice the fine woolen cloak of a town burgher, the chickens scratching in a farmer's yard, the silver chalice visible through a church window. This is the inevitable drift towards the soldier's real salary plunder. The role of plunder as a formal versus informal part of a soldier's compensation is a point of ongoing scholarly discussion for the men on the ground. However, the debate was purely academic. When the official paycheck failed to materialize, the unofficial one had to be collected. It wasn't always a chaotic sacking of a city, though that certainly happened. Often, it was more systematic. It was a tax levied on a village for protection. It was the requisitioning of supplies. It was the quiet acquisition of a stray pig. It was an understanding that the wealth of the land you marched through was, in a way, your deferred wages. Your captain might even encourage it, knowing it was the only thing keeping his company from dissolving. He couldn't pay you in silver, but he could point you towards a town that might have some. This delicate financial ecosystem was ripe for corruption, and one of the most curiously grim examples of this was the practice of dead pays. Imagine a soldier falls in a skirmish, or more likely, to a fever that sweeps the camp. A compassionate captain would report the death, perhaps send a letter to the man's family. A pragmatic and corrupt captain, however, saw a business opportunity. He would simply keep the deceased soldier on the muster roll. When the paymaster finally arrived and called out the name Hans, the captain would call back, on latrine duty or scouting ahead. The paymaster, overwhelmed and eager to finish, would mark Hans as present. The captain would then collect Hans's wage, a ghost's salary for a living man's pocket. It's a bit like modern companies keeping ghost employees on the payroll, proving that some management techniques are truly timeless. When even plunder was scarce and the arrears stretched from months into a year, the simmering resentment could boil over into a full-blown mutiny. Yet, this was rarely a mindless riot. More often, it was a surprisingly organized event, a form of collective bargaining with sharp, pointy negotiating tools. The soldiers would form their own council, a Gemeinde, and elect their own leader, an Electo-a. They would refuse to fight, essentially going on strike. They might even seize control of their own camp or a nearby town, holding it hostage until their employer, the distant prince or emperor, sent the wagons of coin they were owed. It was a dangerous, high-stakes negotiation, a final, desperate attempt to be paid for services rendered, reminding their commanders that while loyalty could be bought, it could not be endlessly maintained on credit. The unreliable paycheck was more than an inconvenience. It was the loose thread that, when pulled, could unravel an entire army. The open field, with its chaotic dance of cavalry and infantry, eventually fades into memory. The sounds of a pitched battle, the clarion call of trumpets, the thunder of a charge are replaced by something far more insidious, something that grinds down the soul with its sheer, monotonous weight. For you are no longer a soldier in a fluid campaign. You are part of a siege. Your world has shrunk to a few square miles of churned-up earth, all of it oriented toward the silent, defiant stone walls of a castle or a fortified city. This is where glory goes to die and is reborn as patience. The first task, and the most enduring, is to dig. Forget the noble charge. Your primary weapon now is the shovel. Day after day, you are part of a team of sappers, men tasked with digging a network of trenches, a creeping earthen serpent slowly making its way toward the castle walls. The work is relentless, a slow battle against dirt and rock under a sun that seems to have stalled in the sky. The sound that defines your days is not the clash of steel, but the rhythmic scrape and thud of pickaxes and spades, a dull percussion that becomes the very heartbeat of the siege. You learn the smell of damp earth intimately, the cool mineral scent that fills your lungs as you drive the trench deeper, zigzagging to protect yourselves from the archers on the walls. The trench is your shield, your home, your entire world. A muddy channel that promises safety, but also feels like a pre-dug grave. It is a slow, agonizing process, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective weapon is sheer, stubborn persistence. And from your new, earthbound perspective, you learn a new kind of fear. It is the fear of the trebuchet. Far behind your lines, these immense wooden siege engines, like monstrous skeletal birds, are assembled with painstaking care. You watch as a team of engineers, The true artists of this warfare calibrates the great throwing arm and the massive counterweight. Then comes the slow armrisnen, groaning creak as dozens of men winch the arm down. A projectile, a boulder the size of a small barrel, is loaded into the sling. And then, with a sudden, gut-wrenching thwump, the counterweight drops, the arm whips upward, and the stone is sent arcing high into the sky. For a moment, there is an almost peaceful silence as you watch it climb, a dark speck against the clouds. Then it begins its descent, and a low whistle builds into a terrifying shriek. It is the sound of pure, unguided physics, a promise of absolute destruction aimed not at you, specifically, but at a general area that you happen to occupy. You don't have to be on the receiving end to feel the dread. The shattering crash as it strikes the castle wall, sending stone and dust erupting into the air, is a sound that shakes the very ground you stand on. It is a constant, looming threat, a lottery of destruction that could go on for weeks. This is the essence of attrition, for sieges were long, grueling affairs that could last for months or even years. Wearing down stone and spirit in equal measure, the besieging army becomes a city in its own right, a sprawling, chaotic settlement of tents, lean-tos, and makeshift huts. And with any city comes a certain aroma. The air becomes thick with a complex blend of scents, the wood smoke from 1,000 cooking fires, the smell of livestock, the sharp tang of the blacksmith's forge. But underneath it all, a more unpleasant miasma begins to gather. It is the smell of thousands of bodies living in close quarters with limited sanitation. The scent of sickness as dysentery and other camp fevers begin their inevitable rounds. And mingling with it all is the faint, sweet, cloying odor of decay, drifting from the no man's land between your trenches and the walls, where the fallen from earlier skirmishes lie uncollected. This grim reality gave rise to some truly inventive, if horrifying, tactics. In a dark twist of ingenuity, the catapults and trebuchets were not always used for throwing stones. The grim use of catapults to launch diseased animal carcasses or human heads into a besieged city served as a form of psychological and biological warfare. Imagine the defenders, already starving and desperate, watching as the bloated corpse of a plague-ridden cow sails over their pristine walls to land in their central square. It was a message and a weapon in one, designed to shatter morale and spread sickness. Sometimes, the severed heads of captured messengers or slain defenders would be sent back over the wall. A brutal reminder that there was no escape. It was the medieval equivalent of a very, very poorly reviewed courier service, guaranteed to ruin everyone's day. This blend of brute force and grim creativity highlights a central question of siegecraft. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of most siege warfare was to starve the enemy out or to create a breach for a decisive, bloody assault. The two strategies were not mutually exclusive, of course, but they represented different philosophies. The starvation approach was a game of logistics and patience. It was a slow strangulation, a bet that your own supply lines were better than the defenders' stockpiles. The assault approach was more direct and far bloodier. It involved focusing your trebuchets on a single section of wall, hammering it relentlessly until it crumbled, or tasking miners to dig a tunnel beneath the wall, prop it up with timbers, and then set the timbers on fire, causing the foundation to collapse. A successful breach meant the fighting would finally move from the field to the narrow, treacherous streets of the city, a brutal final chapter to the long, miserable story of the siege. It seems the commanders of the day couldn't quite agree on whether it was better to be bored or to be terrified, so they usually opted for a bit of both. The sun has not yet crested the ridge, but its pre-dawn glow paints the eastern sky in soft hues of gray and violet. A cool mist clings to the field, muffling sound and shrouding the world in a damp, temporary peace. From your position in the line, you can see them. Across the vast, dew-kissed expanse of grass, the enemy army is a dark, sprawling stain against the landscape. They are not yet individuals, merely a collective presence. A forest of spear points catches the nascent light, winking like scattered stars. Their banners, limp in the still air, add muted patches of color to the scene: deep crimsons, stark blacks, and royal blues you've been taught to despise. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of thousands of men. A low, continuous murmur emanates from the opposing host, a sound like a distant beehive, the collective hum of their own final preparations carrying faintly across the silence. This waiting is its own form of torment. The grand, sweeping strategies have been discussed in the commander's tent, but here on the ground, the world shrinks to the space you occupy. You look to your left and right, at the faces of the men who will stand with you. Some are stoic, their expressions carved from stone, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Others betray their nerves in small and repetitive actions. This is the time for pre-battle rituals, the quiet customs that hold terror at bay. A man nearby meticulously, almost obsessively, sharpens a blade that is already as keen as it can possibly be. He has tested its edge on his thumb a half-dozen times, and you suspect that any more work will simply begin to dull it again. This is where you witness the quirky tidbit tortino of medieval warfare, the private, deeply human moments before the chaos. You see two men, barely old enough to grow a full beard, clasping hands and speaking in low, urgent whispers. They are making impromptu wills with one another. If one should fall, the other is to take his pay, his spare cloak, and a message to a sweetheart in a village you've never heard of. It's a grim but practical pact, a way of asserting some small control over the uncontrollable. A few rows back, a traveling priest moves slowly through the ranks, his gray robes blending with the morning mist. Men kneel before him, their helmets in their hands, their voices a low mumble as they confess their sins, hoping for absolution before facing their judgment. It is a strangely intimate and public display of faith, a shared vulnerability in the face of oblivion. Suddenly, a shift in the energy of your own line. Hoofbeats, rhythmic and confident, draw every eye. The commander, flanked by his standard-bearer, begins his slow ride before the assembled ranks. His armor is immaculate, the steel polished to a mirror shine that reflects the lightning sky. His horse, a powerful destrier, seems to sense the occasion, its steps proud and measured. This is a scene repeated across countless battlefields throughout history. A mainstream fact that a leader's words were considered a vital tool of war. He draws his horse to a halt at the center of the line, his voice cutting through the tense quiet. Some commanders, it is said, were poets of war, their speeches capable of turning fear into righteous fury. Others, one imagines, were less gifted, their attempts at inspiration likely sounding more like a frustrated foreman giving instructions. This one is somewhere in between. He does not shout, but his voice is trained to carry. He speaks of honor, of the defense of their lands, of the divine favor that surely rests upon their cause. He points a gauntleted finger towards the enemy line, calling them godless oathbreakers, men who would plunder your homes and dishonor your families. He promises glory for the living and salvation for the fallen. And, of course, he mentions the spoils of victory, a practical and highly effective motivator. As he finishes, he raises his sword to the sky. A roar erupts from the line, a single guttural sound from thousands of throats. Men beat their swords against their shields, a percussive, metallic thunder that briefly shatters the morning's peace. It is a necessary release, a venting of the pressure that has been building within each man's chest. But as the commander rides on and the cheering subsides, the quiet returns. It is heavier now, more final. The sun has risen higher, burning away the last of the mist, and the enemy is now starkly, terribly clear. You can make out the details of their shields, the shapes of their helmets. The reality of the situation settles in the pit of your stomach like a cold stone. This is the time of personal, quiet fear. Your mouth is dry. Your heart hammers a frantic rhythm against your ribs, a drumbeat only you can hear. You might find yourself thinking of a warm meal, of the face of a loved one, of the simple, profound beauty of a world without this looming shadow. As you stand in your formation, a small part in a vast and complex machine, you might wonder at the sheer difficulty of it all. Banners and horns can signal a general advance or a retreat. But there is still much debate on how much complex, pre-battle tactical planning was possible amidst the noise and chaos of a medieval army deployment. The grand plan, so elegantly drawn on a map in a tent, now seems a fragile thing. Once the lines meet, it will dissolve into 1,000 individual struggles, a chaotic maelstrom of steel and desperation, guided more by a captain's shout and a soldier's courage than any overarching strategy. Then, from the enemy line, comes the sound you have been waiting for and dreading, a single, long blast from a horn. It is answered by your own. The anxious quiet is over. The signal has been given. The horns have fallen silent, and the two great lines of men have met. The initial impact is not the clean crash of steel you might imagine, but a dull, sickening thud that travels through the earth and up through the soles of your feet. It is the sound of thousands of pounds of flesh, wood, and metal colliding at a run. A sound less like a battle and more like the universe's largest, angriest workshop falling down a flight of stairs. Now, you are in the center of it. This is the melee. Forget any notion of a graceful duel, of parry and riposte. If you were hoping for a dramatic, one-on-one exchange of witty banter and swordplay, you have come to the wrong millennium. That was mostly for the bards to invent later. Here in the press, your world shrinks to a space only a few feet wide. Your vision is a chaotic tapestry of sweat-stained leather, the back of a friendly helmet, the rough wood of the shield pressed against your own, and the forest of spear shafts rising and falling like a mechanical nightmare. The air, once cool and open, becomes thick and hot almost instantly, heavy with the communal exhalation of exertion and fear. It is a shoving, screaming, muddy, bloody crush of bodies, so tight that you can barely lift your arms to wield your own weapon. Your shield is not so much a tool for deflecting blows as it is a plank to keep the man in front of you from crushing your ribs. The man behind you does the same, his shield pressing into your back, and so it goes. Hundreds of ranks deep, this is the great push of pike, the engine of the medieval battlefield. It is a contest of pure brute force. Military historians still argue whether battles were won by superior tactics or simply by the brute force and momentum of this immense human scrum. From your perspective on the ground, the answer feels obvious. You are a single gear in a vast grinding machine. Your own strength is irrelevant. What matters is the collective weight and desperate energy of the men around you. You push because if you do not, the line will break. You push because the man behind you is pushing you forward. Your feet slip in the churned mud, searching for purchase. The ground is already slick with more than just rain and dew. You can feel the vibration of every impact, every shield that splinters, every man who stumbles, the shock wave traveling through the formation like a tremor. In this suffocating environment, the greatest dangers are often not the sharp edges of enemy weapons. The horrifying truth, the mainstream fact of the melee, is that many deaths were caused not by a clean sword or axe strike, but by far more mundane and terrible means. To fall here is a death sentence. In the chaos and the crush, no one will stop to help you up. You would be trampled in an instant, your armor providing little protection against the weight of a dozen armored men grinding you into the mud. You could be suffocated. The sheer pressure of the bodies in front and behind you squeezing the air from your lungs until the world fades to black. Or, in a moment of terrible irony, a surge from behind could impale you on the spear point of one of your own comrades in the rank ahead, a friendly weapon becoming the instrument of your end. The battle becomes less about killing the enemy and more about simply staying on your feet, staying conscious, and keeping enough space around you to breathe. As the great push continues, gaps may begin to form. The solid lines might start to fray at the edges, breaking down into a series of smaller, desperate struggles. Perhaps you find yourself face to face with an opponent, locked in a grapple, too close for a longsword, too entangled for an axe. Now, a different kind of weapon proves its worth. This is the moment for the quirky tidbit of our story. The humble dagger. Specifically, a type called a rondel dagger. Its name comes from its distinctive hilt, which often featured two round and flat discs for a handguard and pommel. It wasn't designed for slashing. It was a solid, stiff, tapering spike of steel, an instrument of punctuation. In a grapple with a fully armored knight, a sword is practically useless. His plate harness will turn aside the mightiest of blows. But armor is a system of interlocking plates, and every system has vulnerabilities. In the breathless intimacy of a grapple, the rondel dagger becomes the key. You would try to pin your opponent, using your body weight to control him, while your other hand works the dagger, searching for the small gaps in his steel shell. You would probe for the armpit, the visor slit, the gap at the back of the knee, or the vulnerable joint where the neck guard, or gorget, meets the helmet. It was a grim, personal business, a far cry from the impersonal shoving match of moments before. This little dagger, so often an afterthought in tales of epic battles, was one of the most effective tools for finishing a fight, less a weapon, and more a very pointy, very aggressive key for an armored can of beans. It is a stark reminder that in the end, for all the grand strategy and massed formations, a battle could still come down to two men, wrestling in the mud, with a 9-inch piece of steel deciding the victor. And so you remain, a part of this heaving, groaning mass, where survival is measured in inches, and a single breath is a small victory in itself. Aber, let us now shift our focus and imagine a different kind of life, a different kind of pain. You are a longbowman. Your role in the grand theater of medieval warfare is both pivotal and precarious. Forget the romantic image of a lone figure, silhouetted against the dawn, picking off a single target from a mile away. Your life is one of relentless repetition, immense physical strain, and a unique, ever-present vulnerability. Your day begins not with a trumpet's call to arms, but with the quiet, groaning protest of your own body. As you rise, a familiar ache settles deep in your left shoulder and radiates down your back. It is the ghost of your bow, a constant companion even when the polished yew wood is resting on its rack. The strength required to be a professional archer is immense, a fact etched into your very skeleton. The draw weight of a warbow is not trivial. It can exceed 100 pounds of force, and you are expected to draw it not once, but again and again and again. You practice for hours every day, not for accuracy alone, but for endurance. You pull the thick, waxed hemp string back to your ear, anchor your hand against your jaw, and hold. The muscles in your back and shoulders bunch and burn, a fire that you have learned to control, to breathe through. This constant, asymmetrical strain has reshaped you. Skeletons identified as longbowmen show these physical deformities, like thickened arm bones and curved spines from years of drawing a heavy bow. Your left arm, the one that holds the bow steady against the world, is visibly thicker than your right. Your spine carries a slight, permanent curve, a subtle stoop that marks you as a man of the bow. It is a slow, grinding transformation, your body becoming a living component of your weapon. When you are not practicing, you are maintaining. Your bow is your life, a demanding partner that requires constant care. You check the supple yew for any hint of a crack or splinter, rubbing it down with linseed oil until it gleams with a soft, protective luster. The horn nocks at either end, where the string sits, must be smooth and perfectly shaped. But the bow is only half of the equation. The other half is the string, and more importantly, the endless, almost numbing task of preparing arrows. An army requires arrows not by the quiver, but by the thousand, in the evenings, or during the long lulls of a campaign. You find yourself in the Fletcher's tent. The air is thick with the scent of melted beeswax, simmering animal glue, and the faint, dry odor of feathers. This is the quirky tidbit of your life, the constant, tedious work of fletching arrows, often using goose feathers, and ensuring every arrowhead was properly fixed. You take a bare shaft of ash or poplar wood, smooth and straight. You carefully cut a small slot, the nock, for the bowstring. Then comes the fletching. Using the gray-barred feathers from a goose wing, always the same wing, to ensure the curve is consistent. You trim and glue 3 of them precisely around the shaft. Their slight helical angle will make the arrow spin in flight, granting it stability and a truer path. It is mind-numbing work. A misplaced feather, a drop of glue too much, and the arrow will fly erratically, a wasted effort. You sometimes think a good fletcher is worth his weight in geese, which, given the size of some geese, is a hefty compliment indeed. Once fletched, the arrowheads must be attached. Bodkins for piercing mail, broadheads for soft targets. Each is heated and set into the shaft with a mixture of wax and resin, a bond that must hold upon impact. Arrow after arrow. Your hands grow calloused and stained, working until the pile of finished shafts beside you is a respectable mound. On the battlefield, this preparation finds its purpose. You're not a solitary hunter, but a cog in a great machine of destruction. Your position is behind a line of sharpened stakes hammered into the ground, your only real defense against a cavalry charge. Your captain gives the order, and you begin the rhythm you have practiced for a lifetime. Knock, draw, loose. The sky darkens with 1,000 of your brethren doing the same. It is less an arrow than a cloud, a storm of steel and wood that descends upon the enemy lines. You hear tales of men who can fire 12 or more arrows in a minute, a terrifying thought, but you know the reality of the field. Experts still debate the true effective rate of fire of a longbowman in battlefield conditions, separating theoretical maximums from practical realities. The first volley might be that fast, a furious release of pent-up energy, but after that, a sustainable pace is what matters. A rate of 6 aimed shots a minute is more realistic, more achievable without collapsing from exhaustion. You learn to conserve your strength, to breathe, to pick a spot in the seething mass of the enemy and send your arrow there. You are a weapon of attrition, your purpose to disrupt, to wound, and to create chaos. And yet, for all your power at a distance, you are exquisitely vulnerable. Your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. When the enemy closes, when a flank is turned, or the men-at-arms in front of you break, a terrifying shift occurs. Your 6-foot bow, a moment ago an instrument of immense power, becomes a clumsy, awkward staff. You have a short sword, perhaps, or a mallet you used earlier to hammer in your defensive stakes. In a pinch, it's surprisingly effective at hammering home a point in a close quarters argument. But you are lightly armored, trained for the draw and release, not the parry and thrust. The terror of a fully armored knight bearing down on your position is a cold, sharp thing. Your life depends entirely on the men in front of you holding their line. If they fail, you are simply a man with a long stick, standing in the path of an iron tide. This is the archer's paradox, a master of the battlefield from 200 yards, but a novice at 2. It is a different kind of pain. The ache of the body from the bow, and the ache of the mind from the fear of what happens when the distance vanishes. The echoes of the final charge fade, replaced by a profound and unsettling quiet. The air, once thick with the shouts of men and the clash of steel, now hangs heavy and still, carrying only the low groans of the wounded and the distant mournful cry of a carrion bird. The metallic tang of shed blood mingles with the scent of damp earth and crushed grass, a strangely organic perfume of finality. The great, terrible symphony of battle has concluded, and now the methodical work of the aftermath begins. For you and for the thousands of other common soldiers who survived. This is not a time for celebration. Not yet. This is the time you get paid. You move across the field, a landscape now rearranged with the forms of fallen men. The ground is soft and treacherous underfoot. Here, in the grim quiet, a different kind of hierarchy asserts itself. The dead and the dying have no more use for their worldly goods. And so, the harvest begins. You work with a practiced efficiency, your movements unhurried. You and your comrades move from one still form to the next, stripping them of anything of value. A steel helmet, perhaps dented but still serviceable, is unstrapped and added to your growing collection. A fine mail hauberk, heavy and smelling of sweat and iron, is a significant prize, its thousands of interlinked rings representing a small fortune, months of labor or wages. You pull it carefully over the head of its former owner. The metallic rasp of the rings, a stark, lonely sound in the twilight. Swords, daggers, axes all are collected. Even broken blades can be reforged. Leather belts, coin purses, a silver ring on a cold finger, a small icon of a saint tucked inside a woolen tunic. Nothing is overlooked. This is not an act of malice, but of grim necessity. You are not a ghoul dancing on graves. You are a survivor, a provider. This salvaged steel will be your shield in the next fight, or sold to buy bread for your family, or perhaps even to purchase a small plot of land, a dream that seems almost tangible amidst this grim accounting. You work alongside your comrades, occasionally trading a piece of armor for a better weapon, a silent, grim barter system. It's a strange sort of marketplace, one where the merchandise is always used and the previous owners have no complaints. Historians still argue about this moment, for the line between legitimate, post-battle looting, seen as a rightful part of a soldier's compensation, and unsanctioned. Chaotic pillaging is a topic of ongoing historical debate. To the commanders, it was a necessary, if untidy, way to pay the troops. To you, it is simply the way things are. As you work, you come across a knight. His armor, a canvas of mud and ruin. He is not dead, but his breathing is a shallow, wet rattle. His legs are trapped beneath his fallen horse, and a mortal wound in his side has colored his fine surcoat a deep, dark crimson. He looks at you, his eyes pleading, not for help, but for an end. This is a common and terrible sight. For these moments, there is a special tool, a weapon whose name sounds far more gentle than its purpose. It is the misericord, a long, thin dagger with a stiff, triangular blade. Its name comes from the Latin for mercy, and its design is brutally practical. It is not made for slashing or parrying, but for a single, direct thrust. The blade is slender enough to be slipped through the eye slit of a helmet, into the joint at the armpit, or through the gaps in the plate at the neck. After the knight has been relieved of his helmet, his gauntlets, and any other easily accessible valuables, the misericord is drawn. It is a mercy strike, a final grim courtesy afforded to a fellow warrior whose suffering is beyond remedy. A quick, efficient end to a life of violence, it is an act that is both deeply compassionate and chillingly pragmatic, but not all of the highborn are so unfortunate. As you move through the field, you keep an eye out not just for valuable objects, but for valuable people. This is the other form of payment, and potentially the most lucrative. A common foot soldier, if captured, might be ransomed for a pittance, or simply killed to save the trouble of feeding him. But high-ranking prisoners, like knights, and especially nobles, were incredibly valuable. A captured baron or duke was not an enemy. He was a retirement plan. You learned to spot the signs, the remnants of a silk surcoat bearing a coat of arms, the fine tooling on a leather saddle, the quality of the steel in his armor, even if it's now caked in mud. When one is found, alive and able to be moved, a cry goes up. He is surrounded, disarmed, and helped to his feet with a strange mix of roughness and care. This living prize is worth more than all the helmets and swords on the field combined. His family, his king, his estate, they will pay a fortune for his safe return. A single well-chosen prisoner could make a common man wealthy for life. Of course, you rarely get to keep it all yourself. The soldier who physically captures the noble gets the largest share, but his immediate comrades, his captain, and even the commanding lord will all take their cut. It becomes a frantic, miniature negotiation right there on the battlefield, with men arguing over who saw him first and who deserves what percentage. It's a bit like a modern-day sales team arguing over commission for a massive contract, except the contract is a disgruntled nobleman who would very much like a drink of water. These captured men are treated with a calculated respect. They are guarded closely, but they are given food and water. Their wounds are tended to. After all, you do not damage your most valuable asset. The battle may be over, but for these men, the journey has just begun a long, uncertain path of captivity, negotiation, and waiting for the ransom that will buy their freedom, and perhaps your future. Let us now turn our thoughts to the fragile nature of the body and the universal, timeless fear of being hurt. In our modern world, a deep cut or a broken bone is an inconvenience, a painful episode swiftly managed with sterile equipment, precise knowledge, and blessed anesthesia. But imagine, if you will, a different reality. Imagine the same injury in a world where the very concept of germs is a fantasy yet to be dreamed, and where the most advanced medical care you can hope for is administered by a man who, just an hour ago, was giving someone a shave. This was the terrifying reality of medieval medicine, a field where good intentions and brutal pragmatism walked hand in hand. The best advice for anyone living in the Middle Ages was simple and stark: try not to get hurt. The world of the medieval surgeon was not one of gleaming white rooms and sanitized steel. Instead, picture a room that is part workshop, part apothecary, and part butcher's stall. It might be the back room of a barber's shop, identifiable by the red and white striped pole outside a symbol representing blood and bandages. The air within would be thick with a complex mix of scents, the sharp tang of vinegar, used for cleaning, the sweet, cloying smell of herbs like lavender and rosemary, hung to dry from the rafters in a desperate attempt to ward off foul air, or miasma, which was believed to carry disease, and underneath it all, the faint, metallic scent of old blood. The surgeon himself is not a university-trained physician, a man of letters who would diagnose your imbalance of humors from afar. No, this is a hands-on craftsman, His own hands are calloused, his apron stained. He is a practical man who deals in the physical realities of flesh and bone. Historians still argue whether battlefield surgeons were viewed as skilled professionals or were considered low-status tradesmen, little more than butchers. On one hand, their skills were desperately needed. On the other, their trade was bloody, messy, and intimately connected with death, placing them in a socially ambiguous space. After all, offering to saw off a limb wasn't the best way to make friends at the village fete. Imagine you have been wounded. There is no solace of anesthetic, no gentle countdown into oblivion. There is only the grim acceptance of the ordeal to come. You might be given a potent dose of wine or ale, or a piece of leather to bite down upon. Strong assistants would hold you steady. Their grip's a strange combination of comfort and restraint. The surgeon's tools, laid out on a nearby table, would do little to soothe your fears. They look less like medical instruments and more like something from a torturer's collection or a carpenter's box saws of various sizes, heavy shears, sharp knives, and menacing-looking probes and clamps. The procedure itself would be a blur of overwhelming sensation, a trial of endurance against which your very survival is measured. Nowhere was this brutal pragmatism more evident than in the common art of arrow extraction. A simple arrow wound was rarely simple. The arrowhead, often barbed, was designed to lodge itself deep within tissue, making a clean withdrawal impossible. Pulling it straight out would only cause more catastrophic damage. The battlefield surgeon had a variety of specialized tools for this very purpose. One common device was an arrow spoon, a long, thin metal scoop that could be slid down the arrow's shaft to cover the barbs, theoretically allowing for a safer removal. More common and more terrifying were forceps and screw extractors that gripped the arrowhead and twisted it out. In many cases, the most effective method was also the most harrowing, to push the arrow all the way through the limb or torso to emerge from the other side, where the head could then be snipped off before the shaft was withdrawn. The surgeon, working with focused intensity, was not being cruel. He was being practical. He was fighting against the clock, knowing that a lingering arrow meant almost certain infection and death. The damage caused by the extraction was simply the price of a chance at life. Yet, amidst this landscape of what we would now consider medical malpractice, there were strange, accidental glimmers of success. While learned physicians debated the balance of the four humors, folk medicine and battlefield necessity sometimes stumbled upon remedies that, by sheer luck, actually worked. One of the most fascinating of these was the use of wound packing materials that would seem utterly counterintuitive to us today. Imagine a soldier, far from any formal care, packing his gash not with clean linen, but with moss scraped from a damp stone or a poultice made from moldy bread. It sounds like a recipe for a swift and agonizing end. And yet, on occasion, these wounds healed remarkably well, far better than those treated with cleaner methods. We now know why. The sphagnum moss commonly found in bogs and forests has natural antiseptic properties, absorbing moisture and creating an acidic environment hostile to bacteria. And that moldy bread. It could have been cultivating a strain of Penicillium mold, the very source of penicillin. Without understanding the science, these medieval people had accidentally discovered a primitive form of antibiotic. It was a perfect example of how, sometimes, clutching at straws, or in this case, moldy rye could occasionally save your life. It was a quiet miracle, born not of knowledge, but of desperation and a fortunate roll of the biological dice, proving that even a broken clock is right twice a day, and even moldy bread can be a lifesaver. The last brittle leaves have fallen, and the sky has settled into a permanent, indifferent shade of gray. The campaign season, with its frantic energy and sharp, metallic clangor is over. Now, a different kind of struggle begins the cold misery of winter quarters. This was a grimly accepted reality of pre-modern warfare. The mainstream fact is that military campaigns almost always halted for the winter, not out of any sense of seasonal charity, but due to the sheer grinding difficulty of moving and foraging for food in the cold and mud. Roads dissolved into impassable quagmires, rivers froze solid, and the land, already stripped bare by armies, offered no more sustenance. For you and your fellow soldiers, the halt is a reprieve from battle, but an introduction to a slower, more insidious set of threats. Your army hunkers down, a sprawling, temporary city of weary souls. The first and most pressing question is shelter. Here, there is considerable debate about how soldiers were housed. Were they billeted on resentful civilians, or did purpose-built, if crude barracks exist more commonly than believed? Both options came with their own unique flavor of wretchedness. If you are billeted, you are thrust into the home of a local family. Imagine the tension in that small, smoky house. You are an uninvited guest, an armed representative of an occupying force, sharing a hearth with people who watch your every move with a mixture of fear and contempt. You can smell their simmering resentment, mingling with the scent of their meager cooking. The floor space you are allotted is cold. The thin blanket they provide is barely enough, and every interaction is a quiet negotiation of power and survival. You are warm, perhaps, but you are never, ever welcome. The alternative is the purpose-built winter camp. From a distance, it might look almost organized, a grid of low huts sprouting from the frozen earth. Up close, it is a testament to hurried construction and desperation. These are not charming log cabins. They are drafty hovels made of green wood, woven branches packed with mud and straw, and roofs that offer only a vague suggestion of waterproofness. The wood, not properly cured, smolders and smokes relentlessly, filling the cramped interior with an acrid haze that stings your eyes and catches in your throat. These structures were often built with an architectural philosophy that prioritized fast over structurally sound, or, for that matter, livable. A persistent, seeping dampness clings to everything: your wool tunic, your blanket, the very marrow of your bones. The floor is trodden earth that turns to slick mud with the slightest thaw. You are packed in with a dozen other men, sharing their warmth, their snores, their coughs, and their accumulating filth. And the coughing is constant. It is the winter's dreaded soundtrack, with thousands of malnourished men crammed into unsanitary quarters. Disease moves not like a predator, but like the tide. It's a slow, inevitable creep. Sicknesses that might be a simple nuisance in modern times, a bad cold, influenza, dysentery, become terrifyingly efficient killers. The air grows thick with the subtle, Swedish scent of illness. You watch as men who survive the fury of the battlefield are quietly undone by a fever. There is no advanced medicine here, only crude herbal remedies and the hope that your own constitution is strong enough to endure. Each morning, you wake with a quiet, internal check. Is that a tickle in my throat? Is that ache in my back something more than the cold floor? The camp's latrine trenches, often too close for comfort, become epicenters of contagion, a constant, foul-smelling reminder of the microscopic enemies that are far deadlier than any sword. If disease doesn't take you, boredom might just drive you mad. After months of heightened senses and the constant adrenaline of survival, the sudden, crushing monotony of winter is a profound psychological shock. The days are short and bleak. The nights are an eternity. There are chores, of course. Weapons must be meticulously cleaned and oiled to ward off the rusting damp. Leather straps and boots must be mended and greased. There is wood to be chopped, water to be hauled, and endless, soul-crushing guard duty, staring out into a frozen, featureless landscape. To combat the tedium, you and your comrades turn to invention. Storytelling becomes a prize skill, with tall tales growing taller with each telling, but the primary currency of distraction is gambling. This is where a quirky tidbit of soldiering life emerges to pass the long, dark winter nights. Soldiers would invent complex gambling games using dice made from whatever was at hand. A pig's knucklebone could be filed into a rough cube, or a piece of wood carefully carved and marked with charcoal. These were not simple games of chance. They were intricate systems of bets and bluffs, with rules that evolved and changed from camp to camp, huddled by the weak, flickering light of a tallow lamp or a smoky fire. You might risk everything. The few coins that constitute your pay, saved over months of hardship, could vanish in a single, unlucky roll of the dice. It was a form of high-stakes financial planning that would make a modern accountant weep. But in the depths of winter, the thrill of the risk was often worth more than the money itself. It was a brief, sharp-edged moment of feeling something, anything, other than the cold and the gnawing emptiness of waiting for the world to thaw. The silence that follows the end of a war is a strange and heavy thing. It's not the peaceful quiet of a country morning, but a hollow, ringing void where the sounds of shouting, marching, and metal on metal used to be. For months, perhaps years, your world has been defined by noise and chaos. Now, that cacophony has been switched off, leaving behind an unnerving stillness. The air, no longer thick with the dust of marching columns or the acrid smoke of campfires, feels thin and empty. You find yourself listening for a command that will never come, for a trumpet call that has been packed away. The war is over, but there is no grand announcement, no victory parade through a cheering capital. For you and the men around you, the end is profoundly unceremonious. One day, perhaps on a muddy field or in a hastily assembled camp, your commander gathers what's left of the company. His speech is short, devoid of the soaring rhetoric he used before a battle. He informs you that the treaty has been signed, the campaign is concluded, and your service is no longer required. He might thank you, his voice flat with exhaustion. He might not. And then comes the part you've been waiting for, the part you've been dreaming of during cold nights and long marches your pay. The chests are brought out, but they seem lighter than they should. The paymaster, a man whose face you know well, avoids your gaze. The Lord's coffers, you are told, are nearly empty from the long conflict. There are promises of future payment, of land grants that sound more like fairy tales than firm commitments. What you receive now is a fraction of what you are owed. It might be a handful of silver coins, barely enough to buy passage on a ferry or a few decent meals. For some, the only payment is the gear they carry: the dented helmet, the worn leather gambeson, the sword that has become an extension of their arm. You are dismissed, often hundreds of miles from the village you once called home, with little more than a good luck. The army, once a singular, moving entity, dissolves. It evaporates into thousands of individual men, blinking in the unfamiliar light of peace. The bonds of company and regiment, forged in shared hardship and mortal danger, are severed. The man who slept beside you for a year gives you a nod, turns, and begins walking north. The group you shared your rations with scatters to the four winds. You are, for the first time in a long time, utterly on your own. And so begins the long journey home. This is not a triumphant march. It is a slow, wary, and often dangerous trek. The roads you travel are not friendly. Villagers who once might have offered a soldier a bit of bread and water now look at you with suspicion. They see not a savior, but a potential threat. To them, you are just another armed, unemployed man, and they've learned to be cautious. You'll find doors barred and prices for food suddenly inflated. When a group of you approaches a hamlet, you can almost hear the collective whisper, "Quick, hide the good ale and count the chickens," twice. This leads to a significant and recurring issue throughout history. A mainstream fact is that these large disbanded armies were a major social problem. Suddenly, the countryside was flooded with thousands of men skilled in the art of war, but with few other prospects. They were fit, they were armed, and they were hungry. They couldn't simply slot back into a peaceful, agrarian life. A man who has spent 5 years as a pikeman doesn't remember how to thatch a roof or properly plow a field. His hands are calloused for gripping a spear, not a scythe. This sudden influx of unemployed veterans often led to a spike in crime and instability, a social headache for the very rulers whose wars had created the problem in the first place. Faced with this reality, many men found a grimly pragmatic solution. This is where a curious, quirky tidbit of military history emerges: the formation of free companies. Imagine you're on that dusty road, your final pay already spent on a tough meat pie and a half measure of watered-down wine. You meet another group of soldiers from a different disbanded unit. They're in the same position, unpaid, unemployed, and far from home. Someone has an idea. Separately, you are all vulnerable beggars, but together, you are still a small army. You have your armor, your weapons, and your shared expertise in organized violence. Why not? The thinking goes, continue doing the only thing you're good at. You could offer your collective services to another lord, a wealthy merchant city, or anyone with a quarrel and the coin to pay for it. And so, the Free Company is born, a mercenary band, loyal only to their contract and their captain. It was the medieval equivalent of starting a very aggressive, very pointy consulting firm, and if no paying contracts were available, well, these companies often turned to large-scale, organized banditry, becoming a terror to the very lands they had once been paid to defend. This cyclical process of raising armies for a war and then releasing them, often unpaid, back into the world, created a fascinating and volatile dynamic. Historians still argue about the long-term societal impact of periodically releasing thousands of trained, violent men back into a largely agrarian civilian world. Did it foster a more militarized society? Did it spread new technologies and ideas as these men traveled? Or did it simply create recurring waves of chaos and crime that destabilized entire regions for generations? For you, standing at a crossroads with the sun setting, these grand questions are less important than the immediate one: which way do you go? The road home is long and uncertain. The road to the nearest fortified city might offer the chance of work, either as a guard or as part of a newly forming company. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A chill wind picks up, rustling the leaves in the trees that line the road. It carries with it the scent of damp earth and the coming night. The familiar structured world of the army is gone, replaced by a frightening freedom. Your war may be over, but your struggle, it seems, has just begun. The road back to your village was long, but it is the final few steps that feel the strangest. The smoke from the familiar hearths, the distant bleating of sheep you might have known as lambs, the sight of faces you have held in your memory for years, it is all as you left it. And yet, nothing is the same. You have made it back, but you are a guest in your own past. This final part of the journey is not one of miles, but of acceptance. As you learn to live with the scars that remain, your body is a testament to your travels, a map of hardship etched into skin and bone. There is the long silver-white line that runs along your forearm. a memory of a clumsy parry that almost cost you the use of your hand. It aches with a dull throb when the air grows damp, a more reliable predictor of rain than the village elders' pronouncements. A small joke you keep to yourself. You favor your right leg. A subtle limp that announces your arrival before you speak. The knee was never quite right after that fall from a panicked horse. Then there are the smaller, less noble souvenirs, the 2 fingertips on your left hand, lost not to a sword, but to the brutal, biting cold of a winter watch. You have learned to tie knots and grip tools with what remains, another silent adaptation. These are the visible marks, the ones that earn you a certain look from the other villagers, a mixture of pity, respect, and a quiet thankfulness that it was you and not them. Beneath the surface, other debts have come due. The chronic cough that rattles your chest in the morning is a relic of a fever that swept through the camp, a sickness that took men stronger than you. Your digestion, once ironclad, now rebels at rich foods, a consequence of too many months surviving on hardtack and whatever could be foraged. You have seen firsthand why the life expectancy of a professional soldier was so incredibly low. It wasn't just the sharp edge of a blade that ended a man's story. It was the slow, grinding wear of battle, disease, and deprivation. To have survived it all is a minor miracle, but you feel the cost of that miracle in every joint, in every shallow breath. You are an old man in a young man's body, carrying the weight of years you never should have seen. Hardest of all, though, are the scars no one can see. The quiet of the village is jarring. For so long, your world was a cacophony of noise, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer on armor, the shouting of sergeants, the low murmur of 1,000 men trying to sleep. Now, the silence feels empty, and you find yourself listening for footsteps that are not there, for shouted orders that will never come. A slammed door makes you flinch. The sudden cry of a hawk overhead causes you to scan the sky for arrows that are only in your memory. You sleep lightly, and your dreams are unwelcome visitors, replaying moments with a clarity you wish you could forget. You cannot speak of these things. There are no words for the hollow feeling in your chest, the sense that you are watching your own life from a great distance. While it is anachronistic to use the modern term, scholars continue to discuss evidence for what we would call post-traumatic stress in the writings and behaviors of medieval veterans. All you know is this unnamed sadness, a shadow that clings to you even on the brightest of days. And what is your reward for this service? For this sacrifice of body and peace? It is simply the end of the service itself. You are home because you are no longer useful on the battlefield. There was no concept of a veteran's pension or care. Your retirement was being too old or injured to fight, at which point you were on your own. Your future is now a question mark, relying on the goodwill of family and the strength that remains in your tired limbs. You are a story to be told around the fire, a warning, perhaps, to the young boys with adventure in their eyes. You have walked through the great and terrible events of your time, and you have returned, bearing not treasure, but the heavy, invisible cost of survival. And so, your story for tonight comes to a gentle close. The memories of the campaign, the echoes of the march, the weight of the scars, they all begin to soften now, fading like the last embers of a campfire under a vast and silent sky. All that effort, all that struggle, recedes into the quiet landscape of the past. The aches in your bones can finally ease. The watchfulness in your mind can finally stand down. There is no alarm to wake for, no march to begin at dawn. There is only this present moment of stillness, this sanctuary of rest you have found. Feel the weight of your own body, safe and comfortable, a world away from the hard ground and the cold nights of the story. The journey is over. The long road has led you here, to a place of peace. Let the narrative dissolve, leaving behind only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Let the details of history drift away, replaced by the simple, comforting darkness behind your eyelids. Your mind, having been gently occupied, is now free to wander into its own landscapes, into the soft and welcoming territory of dreams. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to consider, only the slow, deep, and peaceful descent into sleep. The story has ended. Your rest begins. Hush now, and sleep well.